All right, so give me a lay of the land. Where is the race right now? Where are the trends going in? What direction are the trends going in?
I would say that nationally, Kamala Harris's Vibes campaign has been working for her. There's a reason that she's stayed out of the media spotlight and just let this massive amount of paid advertising carry the weight for her. Because we show her currently ahead by 3 points nationally. But I do want to temper that with the fact that Biden was only ahead by a little over four at this point. Actually, he was ahead further at this point, but by election day was only ahead a little over 4 points nationally. And
So wait, can I
yeah,
hammer
go
that,
ahead.
because I know that a lot of folks they keep saying that, like, look, in 2016 Hillary was up by like 6 points. At this point, Biden was up by four. And to your point, if she's only up by three, isn't that good news for Trump?
It is. I think it also shows a really tight race, though, and you can really go back and look at 2022 national polling that would have said we would have had a red wave with Republicans showing a an advantage on the generic ballot nationally. And I think what's happened with the polarization and really COVID has moved people around, and so you have states like Florida that have over 1 million more registered voters in this election than they did in the 2020 election. And so people have self-selected where they're going to live because of COVID. And I think that's one of the underreported facts of this election compared to 2020 is where have people moved from and to, and how is that really affecting what's happening? And then you go look at a state like Pennsylvania that not a whole lot of people moved to and not a whole lot of people moved away from during the pandemic. And I think that's why you see this really, really tight race within Pennsylvania, even
But in
tighter.
Pennsylvania, the registration, and we've shown this, if you look at where it was in 2016, 2020, 20, I mean, Republicans have just done phenomenal closing that registration gap by over 600,000 voters. So if no one's moved, i.e., in or out of state for the most part, then that really suggests that Democrats are losing market share and Republicans are gaining it, which should be good news.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's I'd rather have that trend than the other way in a state like Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania also has probably one of the lowest shares of unaffiliated or non-party affiliated voters of any states in the country. And so, as we've seen this educational attainment shift, where folks without college degrees are becoming more Republican, and those with college degrees are becoming more Democrat, I think some of what we're seeing there is this shift of people who have been voting Republican that are now putting it on their card. But I think that's one of the reasons that this race is so close within Pennsylvania is that massive push for voter registration within the state. And so now it becomes the hard part is capitalizing on how do we get those people to show up. And I recently read an article this weekend of how the Trump campaign, but really its affiliates through Charlie Kirk's organization and Elon Musk PAC, of how they're focusing on these low propensity voters, folks who don't really show up in elections. And I think that if or when we pull this across the line, that is going to be the reason why we did so, because elections are no longer about persuasion. They're about persuasion to turn out.
So how do you, as a pollster, take that into consideration? Because history suggests that Bobby, who just registered to vote, we don't know if he's going to vote. So how do you include him in a poll or not, or her for that matter?
Yeah, that's the challenge, is that humans really suck at projecting their future behavior, but they're really good at living up to or being truthful with their past behavior. And when you've got what we call a 0 of 4 voters, they have voted in 0 of the last 4 similar elections. We only have to go off of what they're telling us they're going to do, because there's no history in that. And I've seen different studies that show that people who register to vote are actually more likely to actually show up to vote, but then they fall off after that first election where they registered to vote. But this is why it's so important that Republicans go vote early, that if they have the opportunity, that they get an absentee ballot and return that by mail, or put it in a drop box, or if they have an opportunity to go vote early. Because what most voters don't realize is that campaigns are pushing towards a vote goal. And they're expending resources to make sure they hit certain vote goals within certain states and certain parts of the state. And if Republican voters wait to vote, they're going to continue expending resource on those Republican voters. And if you go ahead as a Republican voter and return your ballot early, then you are taken off that list. So one, you quit getting all the text messages and mailers and digital ads. But two, we can then take those resources and put them on these 0 for
Right.
brand new Republican voters to make sure that they turn up to vote, because it takes a whole lot more touches because they don't have that history of voting.
There's a story out in the New York Times this morning that says how one polling decision is leading two distinct stories of the election. Let me just kind of read you the key takeaway. It says, this is from their author there, Nate Cohen. It says, this divide is almost entirely explained by whether a pollster uses weighting on recalled vote, which means trying to account for how voters they say voted in the last election. Meaning, I ask you, in the last election, did you vote for Donald Trump or Joe Biden? And that's how they base a lot of their weighting. Do you guys do that or not?
We do, and I would say that most every private pollster does weight to what we call the retro or the recall ballot of how did these folks who responded vote in the prior election. Now, what is not included in that number is who voted for another candidate in that election and who has not voted and did not vote in 2020, but they're telling us they're voting in this election. So I disagree with the whole premise of that article, in that you can't just
really?
say,
Wait, you disagree with the New York Times? Come on.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to, but there is a large swath of voters that did vote for somebody else in 2020, or they didn't vote in 2020 at all. And so it is helpful to be able to control for that factor, because one thing that happens in surveys of all sorts, almost regardless of what mode you're using to collect somebody's response, is that the events of the day or the week do drive over response and under response of certain voter groups. So if you go back and look at right after the disastrous debate for Biden against Donald Trump, you saw a huge drop off in Democrats responding to surveys, and about the same amount of Republicans continued to respond to surveys. So you saw this delta created of in the end polling results that showed that Biden was just getting absolutely waxed. And while I do believe that he was losing, it wasn't the fact that he was going to be completely waxed at that point in the election. And that was because of Democrat under response. And now with Kamala being swapped out, what you see in polling is an over response of Democrats in most places. It's not in every state. So for example, in Pennsylvania, we see it a whole lot more than we see with voters in Georgia, where you've got older, more liberal white women responding at higher rates to surveys in Pennsylvania. But that doesn't necessarily exist, the exact same trend in Georgia. But you have to control for both that recall vote that you're talking about in this article, but also making sure that you're not under or over, taking too much weight in that under or over response of voters based on what's happening in the political environment.
Jeez. Wow, it's actually a little bit of a science there. All right, you mentioned this new poll that you guys have. You're going to be bringing it out tomorrow. Shows her up 3 nationally. I know we don't vote nationally, and this is more of a look at trends. What are you seeing under the hood, though? Where is the movement? Where is the trend coming from?
Well, a lot of it is to be expected is with female voters, and especially female voters under the age of 55. That was a group that was very low from a ballot share perspective when Joe Biden was the Democrat nominee. And Kamala, not just with her being on the top of the ticket, but we've seen the trend continue to grow with women under the age of 55 and both their interest in the election, their determination to vote in the election, who they're choosing as opposed to just being undecided when you give them an option on a Republican versus Democrat generally, or the actual Trump versus Harris race. So what we're seeing overall is that while Kamala does have a slight lead on the ballot, is that Trump has also been picking up ballot share along this way. We're seeing fewer undecideds within this election, but
so she's picking it up from young women, right?
Exactly, and she's picking it up from women.
And where's he doing well?
Donald Trump has been doing even better with men over the age of 55, and so this gender gap that we're seeing is not necessarily even, because even when you go look at where Kamala has been picking up votes, it's significantly more with women under the age of 55 than over the age of 55. And 50 or 55 is a pretty good 50-50 break on if you're trying to divide the electorate in half by an age perspective.
Does she have more to get? Like, in other words, she's doing this podcast. She did this Call Her Daddy podcast all about abortion and sexual. I mean, like, is she just juicing this, saying I can get more out of this? I mean, like, why would you? Is that I'm trying to figure out what the strategy is. Is the media strategy that she's employing, I got to juice this because I know I'm not getting men and I got to get as many women? Or is that stone got any more blood in it?
Well, if you think about elections as persuasion to turn out and not persuasion, then you can look at both candidates' media strategies, especially these kind of non-traditional mediums like podcasts, and see exactly what are they trying to accomplish. And her showing up on that Call Your Daddy podcast shows that she is trying to reach that younger demographic, specifically female voters. And I know the person who runs, I don't know her personally, but the person who runs that podcast mentioned that she also invited Donald Trump onto the podcast, and that he declined, and that there's supposedly a balanced mix of partisanship who listen to that podcast. That's kind of hard to believe. And there's been no data shown to prove that. But you go look at Donald Trump, and what is he showing up on? He's showing up on Theo Vaughn. He's showing up on these podcasts.
Nelk Boys. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
It's younger men. I mean, he needs to go perform better with younger men, and she needs to increase the turnout of younger women. And
but both of these demographics are kind of unknown, right? I mean, you're going after aren't both of those rather low propensity type voters?
They tend to be low propensity, yes, which is why you see the age break shift between a midterm and a presidential election, because those younger voters are just a smaller share of midterm elections because they're not as likely to show up. But what's really interesting is that there are some states, when you look at, because again, this is not a national election, there are some states where you're going to see a higher or equal turnout to 2020. And there are some states like Pennsylvania that at this point, we might actually see a slight decrease in turnout compared to 2020, where 2020 was so much larger of a turnout than 2016.
But why? So why is that? Is that because of COVID? Is that because Biden was, quote, a favorite son of Scranton? Like what juiced it in 2020 that's not now?
Well, judges deciding that they made the law as opposed to followed and applied the law is one of the main reasons. Because if you go look at how could people vote in 2020 compared to now, is that judges were making all kinds of, they were just saying, well, that law doesn't apply because there's a pandemic. And it was so much easier to go grab a ballot somewhere. I mean, in Georgia, for example, they mailed out absentee ballot applications to everybody in the state. And I don't think there's a law that precludes against that. But that's not something they're going to do this time. And so you're likely going to see the absentee mail volume in Georgia, as an example, drop significantly because everybody was not handed an application to vote by mail.
Good call. Yeah, these are these little factors. Like when I do the Road to 270 every Wednesday, that like who's on the ballot, is the Green Party on or not on? Are they mailing out? Like those things, when you're talking about tens of thousands of votes, like that's a huge nugget to keep in mind. So they also talk about Trump doing better with like Latino voters, Black voters. Where does that stand?
Well, looking at our poll that we'll release tomorrow, we've seen that generically Republicans have been doing better with Black voters over the last month, and a little bit not as well in improving their margins with Hispanic voters. I think some of that is a factor of advertising and who's being targeted. And it doesn't appear that the Harris campaign has made a massive play for Black voters as much as they've made it for Hispanic voters. And so this deluge of money is probably playing into that aspect somewhat. But I really do think if you look at why would a young non-white male vote, and it would be because their life has been decimated. Their opportunities have been taken away from them. There was a really good article, I think it was 2 weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal, that looked at young men, specifically non-white young men, and how many of them were living at home now compared to historical numbers, how many of them didn't have a job. And so if Trump can tell that story and speak to a positive, optimistic future for them, I think you are going to see those younger non-white male voters specifically turn out in larger numbers than we've seen in the past. And looking at the polling data shows that should benefit Donald Trump.
Is the women issue where Kamala is doing well completely driven by abortion?
We definitely saw an uptick in abortion in the last 2 months, but really in the last 1 month as a top issue as inflation and economy have dropped. And there's a couple reasons for this. If you go watch the news, it's not being talked about nearly as much as it was 2 or 3 months ago. Even on partisan news channels, I'm not even talking about mainstream news. And then the other aspect is advertising. And we see this in a lot of our, because we do hundreds of state legislative races across the country, which are in really important states like Pennsylvania and Georgia and Michigan and other places that are essentially they're the battlegrounds of the battleground states. And as Democrats spend on the abortion message, just beating up Republican candidates, you can watch the top issue matrix change, and you see that inflation and economy start to come down, and you see the abortion issue start to tick up. And so it really is, they are spending so much money on it. And it really is sinking in with mainly these younger females.
Is there anything that we talk a lot about October surprises and the hurricane in North Carolina, Georgia, that area, what's going on in Israel? Is there any issue that you think at this point that's not one of those three, the economy, immigration, or abortion, that could impact the race at this point?
We have seen national security rise as an issue. It's more so among older voters as opposed to younger voters. That issue rises in salience, but it's not necessarily changing who they're going to vote for. It just is more top of mind because they're consuming a whole lot more news, especially mainstream and cable news. But I think at this point, if you had asked me a year ago what black swan events might occur in this election, I might have called one of them, but not five of them. And to think that there's not going to be another one between now and the election, which is now less than a month away, is hard to believe. But then I also couch that with the fact that I think voters are just so exhausted of campaigning in general, and specifically this campaign, and how up and down and left and right and back and forth that it's been, that if an October surprise happens, voters might just be like, I thought something like that might happen anyways.
Right.
So I don't expect it to have as drastic of an impact as it might have had in, say, 2016.
So I'll go over this later for the viewers in terms of the specifics, but I see the blue wall states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, all trending in Trump's direction. Where do you agree with that assessment, or should I pause on getting too excited?
Well, Michigan to me is one of the most interesting states because there's been polls that have come out that historically have been a little bit more left leaning that are showing a Trump +1 margin right now in Michigan. And the U.S. Senate race there, if you look at kind of the tier 2 U.S. Senate pickup opportunities for Republicans, that has sort of risen to the top of those tier 2 opportunities. And Pennsylvania is challenging because it has 2 massive media markets and then a couple mid-sized media markets, and then about 10% of the state that's in small media markets, or it's in the New York or Washington, D.C. media market. And so it becomes very difficult to advertise at scale in a place like Pennsylvania, which is why I think we've seen less fluctuation there at both the presidential and the U.S. Senate ballot level. And so as I began to look at the road to 270, I wouldn't have 3 weeks ago said that Trump could win via Michigan and not have to win Pennsylvania. But it's beginning to look more like that. Wisconsin is one of those states that it actually has the worst voter file in the entire country. They don't ask age or birth date. And that is one of the most important data points you need to go match to other aspects of commercial and voter data. And so, I almost put Wisconsin in its own category, that it could look really good and we lose it, or it could look middling and we win it. But Michigan is, to me, the story of the next several weeks.
I've been saying this. I think Mike Rogers, that race there against Congresswoman Slotkin, is, to me, the sleeper race. I think Mike Rogers wins on election night. Well, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell to get more.